My name is Elena Vasquez, and I have been called many things in my 43 years. Healer, herb woman, curandera like my grandmother before me, but never, until the day Sheriff William Hayes died, had anyone dared call me a witch. The irony was not lost on me that the same people who had sought my remedies for everything, from broken bones to difficult births, were now gathering outside my small adobe house with torches and angry voices, demanding that I leave Esperanza Valley or face the consequences. All because I had saved a child's life using knowledge passed down through generations of healers in my family. It had started 3 weeks earlier, when Sheriff Hayes brought his 8-year-old son Miguel to my door. The boy was burning with fever, his small body racked with convulsions that the town's doctor, such as he was, had declared beyond medical treatment. Dr. Whitman had pronounced the case hopeless and suggested the family begin preparing for the worst. But Sheriff Hayes, despite his stern reputation as a lawman, was first and foremost a father. He had heard the stories of miraculous recoveries that followed my treatments, whispered accounts of illnesses cured, and injuries healed through methods that seemed to work when conventional medicine failed. "Señora Vasquez," he had said that night, standing in my doorway with his dying son in his arms, "I know there are people in town who don't approve of your methods, but I'm begging you to help my boy. The doctor says there's nothing more he can do." I had taken one look at young Miguel, seeing in his flushed face and labored breathing the same symptoms I had treated dozens of times before. This was not some mysterious ailment beyond human understanding, but a severe infection that could be cured with the right combination of herbs and careful nursing. "Bring him inside," I had told the sheriff, "but understand, this will take time, and he will get worse before he gets better. You must trust me completely, or not at all." For 5 days and nights, I had worked to save Miguel Hayes. I gave him teas brewed from willow bark to reduce the fever, poultices of calendula and comfrey to draw out the infection, and tinctures of echinacea to strengthen his body's natural defenses. I sat beside his bed through the darkest hours, monitoring his breathing, adjusting his treatments, and praying to the saints my grandmother had taught me to invoke in times of great need. Sheriff Hayes had stayed with me throughout the ordeal, helping to hold his son during the worst of the fever dreams, fetching water and supplies, and gradually learning to trust in methods that seemed foreign to his Anglo sensibilities, but proved effective beyond his expectations. On the 6th morning, Miguel's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, his color returned to normal, and by evening he was sitting up in bed asking for food. It was, by any measure, a miraculous recovery from what Dr. Whitman had diagnosed as a fatal illness. Word of the cure spread through Esperanza Valley like wildfire, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of gratitude for saving the sheriff's son, many townspeople reacted with suspicion and fear. How, they wondered, could a Mexican woman accomplish what a trained doctor could not? What dark arts had she employed to snatch the boy back from death's door? The whispers started immediately. Some said I had made a pact with the devil in exchange for supernatural healing powers. Others claimed I had used witchcraft to curse Dr. Whitman, making him misdiagnose the boy's condition so that I could appear more powerful by comparison. A few of the more creative gossips even suggested that I had caused Miguel's illness in the first place, timing the cure to demonstrate my mysterious abilities. Dr. Whitman himself, embarrassed by the dramatic failure of his prognosis, was among the loudest voices spreading suspicion about my methods. Rather than admit that his medical education might be incomplete, or that traditional healing practices might have value, he chose to attack my character and suggest that I was practicing some form of dangerous superstition. "That woman is no doctor," he proclaimed at the saloon, his voice carrying to anyone who would listen. "No properly trained physician would use those barbaric folk remedies. Mark my words, there's something unnatural about what happened to the Hayes boy. Good Christian people don't work miracles. Only God and the devil do, and I know which side I think she's on." Father Martinez, the elderly priest who served our small church, tried to defend me at first. He had known my family for decades and understood that our healing practices were rooted in Catholic tradition as much as indigenous knowledge. But even he seemed uncertain when faced with the growing tide of suspicion and fear. "Elena is a good woman," he would tell people, "but perhaps it would be better if she focused more on prayer and less on other methods." The situation reached a crisis point when Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, announced that she had experienced nightmares every night since Miguel's recovery, dreams in which a woman matching my description performed dark rituals over her sleeping children. Never mind that Mrs. Patterson had brought her own daughter to me just 6 months earlier for treatment of a persistent cough, or that the child had recovered completely under my care. Fear, I was learning, has a way of rewriting history to suit its own purposes. The final straw came when Miguel himself, still weak from his ordeal but eager to return to normal life, told his friends at school about the magic medicines the lady had given him. Children's innocent descriptions of willow bark tea became witch's brew in adult retellings, and my use of herbs and poultices was transformed into evidence of supernatural interference with the natural order. Sheriff Hayes found himself in an impossible position. As a lawman, he was expected to maintain order and respond to the community's concerns about my presence. As a father, he owed his son's life to my intervention. As a man of conscience, he knew that the accusations against me were baseless and motivated by ignorance and prejudice. He came to my house 3 nights before his death, his face haggard with the weight of competing loyalties and impossible choices. "Elena," he said, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands, "I want you to know that I'll never forget what you did for Miguel. Whatever else happens, you saved my boy's life when no one else could." "But," I prompted, seeing the reluctance in his eyes. "But the town council is meeting tomorrow night. There's talk of official action. Some people are demanding that you be arrested and charged with practicing medicine without a license. Or worse. Dr. Whitman is claiming that your methods constitute a danger to public health." I had expected this moment, had seen it approaching like a storm on the horizon, in a territory where Anglo settlers were still establishing their dominance over Mexican and native populations. A woman who possessed knowledge and skills that their own experts lacked represented a threat to the established order. "And what do you intend to do, Sheriff?" I asked quietly. Hayes was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "My job is to enforce the law and keep the peace. But I can't bring myself to arrest the woman who saved my son's life for the crime of being too good at healing people." "Perhaps," I suggested gently, "it would be better for everyone if I simply left Esperanza Valley. There are other places that might be more welcoming to someone with my skills." "That's not right," Hayes said fiercely. "You shouldn't have to leave your home because people are too ignorant to recognize a gift when they see one." But we both knew that right and wrong had little to do with the situation we faced. Fear and prejudice rarely yield to logic or justice, and the mob that was forming against me cared nothing for the lives I had saved or the suffering I had eased. 2 days later, Sheriff William Hayes was found dead in his office, apparently from a sudden heart attack. He was only 36 years old, a strong man with no history of heart problems. But Dr. Whitman quickly pronounced the cause of death and arranged for immediate burial. The timing could not have been worse for me. With the one man in authority who might have protected me now gone, the voices calling for my removal grew bolder and more threatening. By the morning of the sheriff's funeral, there were open demands that I be driven from town before sundown. As I watched from my window while the funeral procession made its way to the cemetery, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I knew something about Sheriff Hayes' death that no one else did. Something that Dr. Whitman had missed in his hasty examination. Something that could have saved the man who had saved my son. But it was too late for the knowledge to help William Hayes. The only question now was whether anyone else would benefit from what I had learned, or whether my gift for healing would die with me in the desert, another victim of fear, ignorance, and the terrible price of being different in a world that demanded conformity. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. 22 years had passed since I left Esperanza Valley, driven away by fear and ignorance, carrying nothing but my knowledge and the bitter memory of being called a witch for saving a child's life. I had found a home among the Pueblo people north of Santa Fe, where traditional healing was still valued, and where my skills were seen as a gift rather than a curse. I was now 65 years old, my hair silver and my hands marked by decades of preparing medicines and tending to the sick. I had trained several younger women in the healing arts, ensuring that the knowledge my grandmother had passed to me would survive another generation. But I had never forgotten Esperanza Valley, or the boy I had left medicine for on his father's grave. The letter arrived on a warm spring morning, carried by a traveling merchant who remembered my name from years past. The envelope was addressed in a careful, educated hand, and when I opened it, I found myself looking at words that brought tears to my eyes. Señora Elena Vasquez, the letter began. You probably don't remember me, but my name is Miguel Hayes. You saved my life when I was 8 years old, and now, 22 years later, you have saved it again. I sat down heavily in my chair, my heart pounding as I read the rest of Miguel's letter. He had grown up to become a teacher in Esperanza Valley, married to a local woman and father to 3 young children. 6 months earlier, he had begun experiencing the same symptoms that had killed his father. Chest pains, irregular heartbeat, and episodes of dizziness that Dr. Whitman, now elderly and still practicing, had dismissed as nervous condition. But Miguel remembered our conversation in the cemetery all those years ago. He remembered my warning about inherited heart conditions, and my promise that help would be available when he needed it. Acting on a mixture of desperation and hope, he had returned to his father's grave and found the medicine bundle I had left there, miraculously preserved by the dry New Mexico climate and carefully wrapped to protect it from the elements. The instructions you left were incredibly detailed, Miguel wrote. Not just how to prepare the medicines, but when to take them, what symptoms to watch for, even how to modify the treatment based on different conditions. It was like having a master healer guiding me through every step of the process. Miguel had followed my grandmother's recipe exactly, brewing teas from dried hawthorn berries to strengthen his heart, taking tinctures of digitalis to regulate his heartbeat, and using other herbs to improve his circulation and reduce the strain on his cardiovascular system. Within weeks, his symptoms had begun to improve, and within months, he felt better than he had in years. Dr. Whitman thinks it's a miracle, Miguel continued in his letter. He can't explain why my condition improved so dramatically, and I haven't told him about your medicine. I don't think he would understand, and I'm not sure this town has changed enough to accept the truth about where my cure came from. But the most remarkable part of Miguel's letter came at the end, where he described the changes that had taken place in Esperanza Valley over the past 2 decades. The town had grown and prospered, bringing in new residents with different backgrounds and more open minds. Several Mexican-American families had risen to positions of prominence in business and local government, and perhaps most significantly, a new doctor had arrived 5 years earlier, a young woman trained in both modern medicine and traditional healing practices. Dr. Maria Santos grew up in a family of curanderas, Miguel wrote. She's been working to bridge the gap between old and new forms of healing, and she's been incredibly successful. When I told her about my recovery and showed her your instructions, she was amazed by the sophistication of your knowledge. She said you were ahead of your time, combining the best of traditional medicine with careful observation and documentation. Dr. Santos had asked Miguel to extend an invitation on her behalf. Would I consider returning to Esperanza Valley, not as a healer working in secret and fear, but as a respected member of a medical community that had finally learned to value diverse approaches to healing? I set the letter down and walked outside, looking toward the southern mountains that separated me from the place I had once called home. The invitation was tempting, but I was no longer the woman who had been driven away in fear and anger 22 years ago. I had built a new life, found acceptance and respect among people who valued my gifts, and trained a new generation to carry on the healing traditions. But Miguel's letter had reminded me of something important. The knowledge I possessed wasn't truly mine to keep. It belonged to all the people who might benefit from it, regardless of their prejudices or their willingness to accept help from unconventional sources. If Esperanza Valley was truly ready to embrace traditional healing, then perhaps it was time for me to consider returning. A month later, I received a second letter, this one from Dr. Santos herself. She had heard my story from Miguel and several other longtime residents who remembered my work. She was writing to formally invite me to join her practice as a consulting herbalist and traditional healer, working alongside modern medicine to provide the best possible care for their patients. The town council has voted unanimously to extend this invitation, Dr. Santos wrote. Many of the same people who once feared your methods have since benefited from traditional healing practices introduced by other practitioners. They understand now that they drove away someone who could have saved lives and reduced suffering if they had been willing to listen with open minds instead of closed hearts. The final element that convinced me to accept their invitation was a personal note from Miguel, included with Dr. Santos's letter. In it, he described how he had been sharing the story of my exile and return with his students, using it as a lesson about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of keeping an open mind about different ways of understanding the world. My children know that they owe their existence to a woman. The town once called a witch, Miguel wrote. Without your medicine, I would have died young like my father, and my family would never have existed. They're growing up in a world where that kind of healing wisdom is valued rather than feared, and I think you would be proud of the change you helped inspire. I returned to Esperanza Valley on a bright autumn morning, riding in a wagon loaded with my medicines and accompanied by one of my apprentices, who had volunteered to help establish the new practice. The town had indeed changed dramatically in my absence, growing from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community with paved streets, electric lights, and all the amenities of modern civilization. But the most important change was in the people themselves. The fear and suspicion that had once driven me away had been replaced by curiosity and respect for different healing traditions. Dr. Santos introduced me to the community as a master, healer whose knowledge would complement and enhance the medical services already available. The reunion with Miguel was particularly emotional. The frightened 8-year-old I had treated for fever had grown into a confident man, healthy and strong, with children of his own who called me Abuela Elena and listened eagerly to stories about the healing plants that grew in the desert around their town. You know, Miguel said as we sat on his porch watching his children play in the yard, I never thanked you properly for leaving that medicine at Papa's grave. Not just for saving my life, but for believing I would be smart enough and brave enough to use it when the time came. I watched his youngest daughter, a girl of about 8 with her father's intelligent eyes and gentle nature, and I saw the future of healing in Esperanza Valley. This child would grow up in a world where traditional and modern medicine worked together, where healers were respected regardless of their background or training, and where knowledge was valued for its ability to reduce suffering rather than judged by the credentials of those who possessed it. Miguel, I said, the greatest medicine I ever left at your father's grave wasn't the herbs or the instructions. It was the faith that someday, somewhere, there would be people wise enough to accept healing wherever it came from. Your town has finally grown into that wisdom, and that gives me more hope than any cure I've ever discovered. They had called me a witch for healing the sheriff's son, so I had left the cure at his grave for when it would be needed. But what I had really left there was a seed of change, a promise that knowledge and compassion would eventually triumph over fear and ignorance. And now, at last, that seed had grown into something beautiful, a community that understood that healing comes in many forms, and that wisdom is too precious to waste because of prejudice or pride. Thank you for watching this incredible story of perseverance, healing, and the triumph of knowledge over fear. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss our amazing true stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. The funeral of Sheriff William Hayes was the largest gathering Esperanza Valley had seen in years. Nearly every resident of the small New Mexico town turned out to pay their respects to a man who had been respected, if not always loved, for his fair enforcement of the law and his dedication to keeping the peace between the Anglo settlers and the Mexican families who had lived in the valley for generations. Watched the procession from my kitchen window, noting how Miguel Hayes, dressed in his Sunday best but still pale from his recent illness, walked beside his mother with the solemn dignity of a boy forced to grow up too quickly. The sight of him, alive and healthy because of my intervention, only deepened the bitter irony of the situation I faced. As the crowd dispersed from the cemetery, many of them walked past my house on their way back to town. I could hear their conversations through my thin walls, the mixture of grief for their lost sheriff and anger toward the woman they blamed for bringing evil to their community. Poor William, Mrs. Patterson was saying to a group of other women. Dying so young and right after all that business with the witch woman? Makes you wonder if there's a connection. I heard she cursed him for threatening to arrest her. another voice added. Mexican witches have ways of stopping a man's heart from beating, you know. My cousin in Santa Fe told me about a case just like this. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of accusation and suspicion settling over me like a burial shroud. These people had already decided I was guilty of something, and now they were simply choosing which crime to pin on me. The fact that Sheriff Hayes had died of natural causes, and that his death had actually worked in their favor by removing my only protection, seemed irrelevant to their need for someone to blame. But I knew something they didn't. Something that Dr. Whitman had missed in his perfunctory examination of the sheriff's body. I had seen the symptoms before Hayes died, had noticed the subtle signs that pointed to a very specific and treatable condition. If I had been consulted, if I had been allowed to examine him, Sheriff William Hayes would still be alive. The knowledge ate at me like acid as I prepared for what I knew would be my final night in Esperanza Valley. I had already packed my few belongings, rolled my herbs and medicines into portable bundles, and made arrangements to leave before dawn. But there was one last thing I needed to do, one final gift I could leave for a community that was driving me away. As darkness fell over the valley, I made my way carefully through the shadows toward the cemetery where Sheriff Hayes had been buried that afternoon. The new grave was easy to find, marked by the dozens of flowers and small mementos that townspeople had left in tribute to their fallen lawmen. I knelt beside the freshly turned earth and unpacked the bundle I had brought with me. Inside was a collection of herbs, carefully measured and prepared according to a recipe my grandmother had taught me, along with detailed instructions written in my careful script on a piece of parchment. But this was not a cure for the dead sheriff. This was medicine for the living, specifically for the condition that had killed William Hayes and that ran in families, passed from parent to child like a terrible inheritance. This was medicine for young Miguel, who would likely develop the same heart weakness that had claimed his father, probably sometime in his 20s or 30s. The irony was almost overwhelming. The same people who were calling me a witch and driving me from their town were condemning a child to death through their ignorance and prejudice. If Miguel developed his father's condition in 20 years, Dr. Whitman would be no more capable of treating it then than he was now. The boy would die as his father had died, suddenly and unnecessarily, because the knowledge that could save him was being driven away along with the woman who possessed it. I placed the medicine bundle carefully on Sheriff Hayes's grave, along with a letter addressed to Miguel for when he came of age. In it, I explained his father's true cause of death, described the symptoms he should watch for in himself, and provided detailed instructions for preparing and using the herbal remedy that could prevent the same fate from befalling him. Forgive me, William, I whispered to the silent grave. I could have saved you if you had come to me with your symptoms. Instead, you died protecting people who would rather see your son follow you to an early grave than accept help from someone they consider beneath them. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a small figure approaching through the darkness, and my heart nearly stopped when I recognized Miguel Hayes, still dressed in his funeral clothes but now carrying a small lantern that cast dancing shadows across the headstones. "Señora Vasquez?" he called softly. "Is that you?" I considered running, disappearing into the darkness before the boy could confirm my presence at his father's grave. The last thing I needed was for someone to find out I had been conducting what they would undoubtedly call dark rituals over the sheriff's burial site. But something in Miguel's voice, a quality of sadness and confusion that spoke to the healer in me, made me stay. "Hello, Miguel," I said gently. "What are you doing here so late?" The boy approached slowly, his lantern revealing a face streaked with tears and marked by the kind of grief that sits too heavy on young shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I keep thinking about Papa, about how he died so suddenly. Dr. Whitman said it was his heart, but Papa never seemed sick. He was strong." I knelt down to the boy's level, seeing in his intelligent eyes the same curiosity and quick understanding that had made him such a good patient during his recent illness. "Sometimes, Miguel, hearts can be sick in ways that don't show on the outside. Your father had a condition that runs in families, something that might not cause problems for years and then suddenly becomes dangerous." "Is that why you're here?" Miguel asked, looking at the medicine bundle I had left on the grave. "Are you trying to help Papa somehow?" The question pierced my heart with its innocent directness. How could I explain to an 8-year-old boy that I was leaving medicine for him, for a disease he didn't yet have but would likely develop, written instructions that might save his life 20 years in the future? "Miguel," I said carefully, "there are things about healing that most people don't understand. Sometimes the best medicine is the kind that prevents sickness rather than cures it. What I've left here is information that might be important to you someday. When you're older," the boy nodded solemnly, accepting my explanation with the trust that children sometimes place in adults who have proven themselves worthy of it. "Señora Vasquez, are you really a witch like people are saying?" "No, mijo," I replied, using the affectionate term my own grandmother had called me. "I'm a healer, like my grandmother before me and her grandmother before her. We use plants and prayers and knowledge passed down through generations to help people get better when they're sick." "Then why are people so angry at you? Why do they want you to leave?" It was a question that went to the heart of everything wrong with the situation I faced, and I struggled to find an answer that an 8-year-old could understand without losing hope in the basic goodness of people. Sometimes, Miguel, people are afraid of things they don't understand. They see someone doing something different, something that works in ways they can't explain, and they assume it must be dangerous or evil. It's not right, but it's how some people react to anything that challenges what they think they know. Miguel was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness of a child forced to confront adult complexities too early. "Will I see you again?" "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "I'm leaving Esperanza Valley tonight, going to find a place where people might be more accepting of what I do. But Miguel, I want you to remember something important." I took his small hands in mine, feeling the pulse of life and health that my herbs had helped restore just weeks earlier. "You're going to grow up to be a strong, good man like your father. But someday you might need help that Dr. Whitman can't provide. When that day comes, remember what I've left here tonight. Remember that healing comes in many forms, and wisdom doesn't always come from the people who claim to have the most education." As we parted ways in the cemetery, Miguel returning to his grieving mother and I preparing for my journey into exile, I felt the complex mixture of sadness and hope that marks all endings that are also beginnings. I was losing my home, my community, and my place in a world that had no room for women like me. But I was also carrying forward knowledge and traditions that had survived centuries of persecution and would survive this latest challenge as well. The medicine I left at Sheriff Hayes's grave represented more than just herbal remedies and written instructions. It was a bridge across time, a gift from one generation to the next. A promise that healing would continue even when healers were driven away. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of courage and family. Hit that subscribe button to never miss our incredible true tales.